I had a Greek immigrant father and mother, and yes, I am an American dreamer. Today, the majority of the American people do not believe their children are going to do better than they, and neither do I. Unless, that is, we change our ways and confront some of America's long-term challenges that I call undeniable, unsustainable, and yet politically speaking, untouchable. I want to repeat long-term challenges, not the short-term ones that our short-termitis society gets fixated on, subprimes, housing prices, credit crunches, swine flu, and so forth. I must tell you up front that this is not going to be an inspirational, charismatic, uplifting speech. That's for two reasons. In the first place, I have negative charisma. And in the second place, I am a great believer in the idea that an informed democracy is the best democracy. And Americans have been misinformed, disinformed, and sometimes quite intentionally, politicians who believe that the American people cannot take the plain, hard truth. They also believe that it's not only politically incorrect, but politically terminal to ask the American people for any shared sacrifice. I simply do not accept that. I collect oxymorons, and some of you Democrats probably consider this an oxymoron, but we had a Nixon humorist named Herb Stein, who used to say if something is unsustainable, it tends to stop. Or he said, if you don't like that one, if your horse dies, I suggest you dismount. Now, we act as though we can ride this horse indefinitely, and of course we can't. So we go a step further than LBJ. Remember when LBJ got severe criticism because he was trying to sell the Vietnam War plus domestic spending, and he got criticized for guns and butter. Well, now that isn't good enough for us. We've got to have guns, butter, and tax cuts. Now, if you doubt me, can you think of a single shared sacrifice that you have been asked to make since 9/11? I appreciate your mentioning that crack about my being the most powerful Secretary of Commerce since Herbert Hoover. In the first place, given what happened to Herbert, I don't know quite what the meaning of that is. But frankly, anybody that's had the job knows that a powerful Secretary of Commerce is an oxymoron. There's never been one in my experience. I collect oxymorons now, and my current favorite is the House Ethics Committee. Okay. Let's move on to the second of the long-term challenges, the current account, balance of payments, and savings deficits. Because we consume so much more than we produce, and because we save so little, we have to borrow the rest from foreign countries. How much are we projected to borrow from abroad? I can tell you the amounts are dysfunctional, dangerous, and unprecedented. We asked the Peterson Institute for International Economics, poorly named it seems to me, if they would make projections of what the foreign debt of this country would look like on the current path. The numbers are so large as to possibly cause you a serious systemic digestive problem. So I won't give you the numbers, but I will quote from the report. The projected path is so unsustainable and dangerous that a crisis would virtually be certain to occur long before the U.S. reached such a painful point of reckoning. Now, in the course of doing that, we also leave ourselves not only very vulnerable to economic risks, but to geopolitical risks. I don't know how many of you remember the Suez Canal incident, when in President Eisenhower's time, the Brits and the French decided to send military troops into the Suez Canal. That was very much against U.S. foreign policy. We were the holders of large amounts of British securities. So a senior official of the Eisenhower administration had a quiet but firm talk. It said, we find this really quite alien to what we think is in our national interest, and therefore if you persist in keeping the troops there, we will find it necessary to sell our pound securities. Within 10 days, their troops were removed. Now, why do we believe that the Chinese, for example, who have already $1.4 trillion of treasuries, would feel any less likely to act in their own political interests and our disinterest? There are various scenarios about what would happen with these foreign debts. Paul Volcker, the esteemed, iconic Paul Volcker, says there's a 75% chance of a hard landing within 5 years. In that scenario, as you know, the dollar falls suddenly and deeply, interest rates rise steeply, producing both high inflation and low growth. Now, if we had more savings at the national and the personal levels, our country would not be exposed to these risks. But as you all know, our national savings rate has plummeted. We've gone from being one of the biggest savers to the least, the lowest. And in some years, recently, we had an unheard of negative personal savings rate. Now, as recently as the early 90s, we were saving 8 to 10% of our disposable income. And if we're going to rescue our economic future, we as a nation and as a people simply must save more and consume less. And nothing would please me than to see the temporary increase that we've now had to about 5 or 6% of our disposable income continue rising to 8 or 10 or more. We are the only developed country that does not have a health care budget. It's an open-ended cost-plus budget. Bigger the cost, the bigger the plus. We have a perverse set of incentives, a payment system that is based on the consumer having no stake at all in what it costs, because as far as the consumer is concerned, Medicare is cheap and other health care is cheap or free to them. But we provide providers with an incentive to do more tests, more procedures, more surgeries, more of everything, whether we need them or not. In the last year of life, we spend about 25 to 33% of Medicare. The difficulties of this issue, emotionally and ethically, I'm very much aware of. We have the Terri Schiavo case. We have the so-called death panels. But the point is that this illustrates some of the tough decisions we're going to have to make. Now, what is needed to be done about these challenges? The good news is there's some very sensible and worthwhile solutions that also protect the truly needy. The problem, therefore, is not the proposals. The problem is the process of getting something done. Another piece of good news, and as Ed Hagem, who's here, knows, I've been railing about long-term budget deficits for 25 years. I have never seen a time when the public is more concerned about these issues than they are right now. There will be several ingredients that will be required. First, without presidential leadership, nothing is going to happen. Secondly, it must be bipartisan in its approach. My Nebraska friend, who honored me by coming here today, will remember that we used to do pheasant hunting and some turkey hunting in Nebraska, at least around Kearney, where I was born. You remember when you go out and hunt and the first turkey to lift up its head get it shot off. So politically, politicians are enormously reluctant to propose actions that require sacrifice alone. They must do it as a group effort. But finally, and most important, we have to educate, motivate, and activate the American public. You know, it's so easy to blame the politicians. But it is we, ultimately, who have to make it safer for them to do the right thing. Because unlike what our founders had envisioned, most politicians today consider their jobs as careers not as short-term transitions in their life. And to them, the issue is not the next generation. The issue is the next election and how are they going to get elected. So we have to make it safer for them to do what privately they know they should be doing. Now, we are a resilient and responsive country. I remind you of the greatest generation and why they deserve to be called that. After the Second World War, we had 122% of the GDP debt. About 25, 35 years later, we had reduced that debt to 23% of the GDP. Not only that, but that they paid for, financed a GI Bill, the biggest infrastructure program in our history, the Marshall Plan, the UN, and so forth. So we've done it before, and there is no reason we cannot do it again. Ultimately, this is a moral issue that I'm talking about, and I know how convincingly morality lectures come from Wall Streeters these days. But nonetheless, there was a German philosopher named Bonhoeffer who said the ultimate test of a moral society is the kind of world that it leaves to its children. And in that sense, I think I'd like you to think of this as being essentially an immoral act that we're involved in. So I say this to all of us, let's get off of our respective butts and make it safer for politicians to make the tough choices, to do the right things, not simply for our kids and grandkids, but for this remarkable country's future. Let's make it unsafe for politicians to do what they're doing now, which is to do nothing, to continue to deny the undeniable, and to continue to pretend that you can sustain the unsustainable. I know this is all very daunting, but I ask myself, and I ask you again, is the alternative not to try? Thank you very much.